The gavel echoed off the marble walls, but it was my uncle's smug laugh that cut through the silence of the courtroom. He leaned over, waving a forged property deed in my face and whispered, "I own your father's house now, loser. Pack your bags and get out." His lawyer sneered beside him, already celebrating what they thought was a guaranteed victory. They wanted me to break down. They wanted tears. But I sat completely still, refusing to give them the satisfaction. They had no idea that the federal judge sitting on the bench was staring past their fraudulent paperwork, eyeing the faded scar across my father's face. When the judge's hand began to tremble, he didn't hit the block. He dropped the gavel, looked straight at my uncle and said, "I remember you." What happened next turned a rigged trial into an unforgettable reckoning. My name is Claire Miller and I am 27 years old. If you looked at my father, Commander Arthur Miller, you would see a man built out of stubborn pride, unshakable integrity, and calloused hands. He was a decorated military veteran who spent 30 years serving his country, but if you asked him what his proudest achievement was, he would point right at our family home. He built that two-story house in the countryside with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. It wasn't just wood and stone to us. It was a sanctuary filled with decades of sweat, sacrifice, and unconditional love. When my father's health began to rapidly decline last year, my world started falling apart. That was when my father's younger brother, Uncle Richard, suddenly reappeared in our lives. Richard had always been the black sheep of the family, a silver-tongued opportunist who only showed up when he smelled money. But back then, desperate and exhausted from round-the-clock caregiving, I made the mistake of believing he actually cared. He moved into our guest room under the peaceful guise of helping out during my father's final months. Instead of helping, Richard was quietly plotting. While my father was bedridden and heavily medicated, Richard manipulated power of attorney documents, whispering promises of handling routine medical bills. The very week my father passed away, before the soil on his grave was even dry, Richard revealed his true colors. He didn't just claim a share of the estate. He produced a signed property transfer deed claiming my father had willingly gifted him the entire house, stripping me of my home, my heritage, and my father's final legacy in one cold, calculated move. I returned to my childhood home 3 days after the funeral, holding a box of my father's personal belongings, only to find the key turning uselessly in the lock. The deadbolt had been changed. Before I could even process what was happening, a sharp voice called out from the porch. It was Uncle Richard, flanked by a man in a tailored suit holding a manila folder. "You're trespassing, Claire," Richard said, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. The man beside him stepped forward, introducing himself as Richard's attorney, and handed me an official legal paper. It was a formal notice of eviction, giving me 48 hours to clear out my personal items. "You can't do this, Richard. This is my father's house," I shouted, my voice trembling with rage. Richard casually leaned against the doorframe, adjusting his watch. "Your father knew he owed me, Claire. He signed over the deed weeks ago to settle old family debts. You have no legal standing here, no money to fight me, and no proof otherwise. I'm putting this place on the market by Friday for a quick cash sale. So pack your bags and get out." They expected me to break down, to cry, to surrender without a fight. But as I stood on that porch, looking at the house my father built with his own hands, a cold determination took over. I wasn't going to let a thief erase my father's legacy. I immediately hired a local legal advisor, spending the last of my savings. Together, we spent sleepless nights digging through my father's old military archives, service records, and personal papers, desperate to find anything that could expose Richard's fraudulent claim before our day in court. The morning of the court hearing arrived, heavy with oppressive heat and tension. Walking into the high-ceilinged courtroom, I felt small, but I held my head up high. Across the aisle, Uncle Richard sat at the defense table, wearing a crisp suit and looking like he'd already won. Beside him sat his high-priced lawyer, spreading out stacks of neatly organized documents with an air of total supreme confidence. When the proceedings began, Richard's attorney took control of the room immediately. He presented the property transfer deed, pointing dramatically to what appeared to be my father's signature at the bottom. To make matters worse, they brought forward 2 paid witnesses, former neighbors who claimed my father had spoken openly about gifting the estate to Richard to settle old, unrecorded family debts. Every lie felt like a physical blow to my chest. "Your Honor," Richard's lawyer announced smoothly, stepping toward the bench. The paperwork is notarized, the signature is genuine, and the intent is clear. Arthur Miller willingly handed over his estate out of gratitude to his brother. Miss Claire Miller has no legal claim, no counter-evidence, and no ground to stand on. I sat beside my legal advisor, watching helplessly as the court clerk took the signed deed and my father's military service records, carrying them up to the raised bench. Judge Vance, a stern man with sharp gray eyes, picked up the file and began reviewing the documents. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with a smug grin, believing the trap had finally sprung shut. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that somehow, somewhere, the truth would find a way to break through their wall of lies. Judge Vance turned the page of the evidence folder, his steady hands suddenly freezing mid-motion. The air in the courtroom grew heavy as he stared down at the military service records attached to the file, documents detailing Commander Arthur Miller's decorated service history, unit numbers, and official discharge papers. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the wall clock. The judge slowly raised his head, his sharp gray eyes sweeping across the courtroom. He completely ignored the high-priced attorney standing at the podium. Instead, his gaze passed over me, pausing briefly on the small, framed military portrait of my father sitting on my legal desk, before locking squarely onto Uncle Richard. Uncle Richard's smug smile began to falter, flickering like a dying light. He adjusted his collar, suddenly looking uneasy under the magistrate's intense, unblinking glare. Judge Vance removed his reading glasses, setting them down on the wooden bench with a soft clack. His right hand reached for the gavel, but instead of striking the block to deliver a ruling, his fingers tightened around the handle until his knuckles turned white. I saw a sudden flash of profound emotion pass across the judge's weathered face, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He leaned forward over the bench, looking directly into Richard's eyes. The silence in the room stretched so thin it felt as though it might snap. Then, in a low, gravelly voice that echoed off every high wall of the courtroom, Judge Vance spoke 3 words that shattered the quiet. "I remember you." Richard blinked, his confidence evaporating instantly. I beg your pardon, Your Honor?" "I said I remember you," Judge Vance repeated, his voice dropping into an icy tone that sent a chill straight down my spine. The entire courtroom froze, caught in the sudden electric shift of power. Judge Vance stood up from his leather chair, his presence towering over the bench. He pointed a steady finger directly at Uncle Richard, whose face had turned completely ghost white. 30 years ago, I was a young lieutenant under Commander Arthur Miller," Judge Vance declared, his voice booming through the room. "He saved my life in a war zone, carrying me through enemy fire when I couldn't walk. I know his character, I know his dedication, and most importantly, I know his signature." Arthur Miller signed every official document with a distinct flourish he learned in the service. A mark he never omitted, not once in his entire life. The judge slammed his palm onto the desk, rattling the water glass beside him. "This signature on your supposed deed is missing that mark. It is a crude amateur forgery." Richard's high-priced attorney gasped, frantically shuffling through his papers as he realized the quick victory he'd planned was disintegrating. "Your Honor, if I may," my client assured me. "Silence." Judge Vance cut him off with an icy glare. "I also remember you, Richard. 30 years ago, when your brother was deployed overseas defending this nation, you tried to steal his military paychecks through mail fraud. He didn't prosecute you back then out of foolish family mercy. But you haven't changed. You are a predator who preys on your own blood." Judge Vance turned his sharp gaze toward the court clerk. "I am ordering an immediate real-time forensic audit of this document by the State Crime Lab. Furthermore, I am directing the bailiffs to ensure no one leaves this courtroom. We are going to uncover every single lie told here today." Uncle Richard collapsed back into his seat, sweating profusely as his lawyer backed away from him in complete panic. The trap had finally sprung shut, not on me but on the thief who thought he could erase my father's memory. The courtroom atmosphere transformed instantly from legal formality to absolute chaos. Judge Vance didn't hesitate for a single second. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a thunderous crack that echoed like a gunshot off the high plaster ceilings. "The court officially declares the property transfer deed void, invalid, and born of criminal fraud." Judge Vance roared, his voice cutting through the room. "Bailiffs, place Richard Miller under arrest immediately for grand larceny, forgery, and felony perjury. 2 uniformed bailiffs moved in swiftly, grabbing Uncle Richard by the arms and pulling him up from his chair. The cocky smirk that Richard had worn all morning vanished entirely, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. "Wait, Your Honor, please. It was a mistake. I can explain," Richard cried out, his voice cracking into desperate, pathetic sobs as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. He frantically looked toward his high-priced lawyer for help, but the attorney was already stepping back, raising his hands in defeat, and packing his briefcase to distance himself from the sinking ship. "Save your explanations for the grand jury," Judge Vance snapped coldly. "You thought you could strip Arthur Miller's daughter of her home. Instead, you have stripped yourself of your freedom." As the bailiffs dragged a blubbering Uncle Richard through the heavy double doors, a stunning silence washed over the room. Judge Vance took a slow, deep breath, adjusting his dark robes. Then, to the shock of everyone present, the magistrate stepped down from the raised bench. He walked slowly past the railing, stopping right in front of my desk. Looking down at me, his eyes filled with profound respect, Judge Vance drew himself up straight. Slowly, solemnly, he brought his hand up to his forehead and offered a crisp, formal military salute to my father's portrait resting on my desk. "Your father was a great hero, Claire," Judge Vance said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "His legacy and his home are officially safe. You have fought well." The legal aftermath was swift and uncompromising. With Judge Vance presiding over the preliminary hearings, the state prosecutor filed full criminal charges against Uncle Richard. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence proving forgery and perjury, Richard pleaded guilty to avoid a maximum prison sentence. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay full financial restitution for my legal fees, court costs, and the damages caused to our estate. His high-priced attorney barely managed to escape prosecution himself, leaving Richard completely alone to face the consequences of his greed. 2 weeks after the trial, I stood in the driveway of my childhood home, holding the original brass key. The temporary locks Richard had installed were gone, replaced by the sturdy deadbolts my father had put in years ago. Walking through the front door, the house smelled just as I remembered, a warm mix of polished cedar wood, old leather books, and faint engine oil from my father's garage tools. The dark shadow of deception that had hung over these rooms was finally lifted. I spent the next month restoring the house, framing my father's medals, and placing his military service portrait right above the fireplace mantel in the living room. Every corner of this house now stands as an unshakable monument to his honor, his sacrifice, and the enduring bond of real integrity. Living here now brings a deep, quiet peace that no amount of stolen money could ever buy. Sometimes, standing on the front porch as the sun sets over the countryside, I feel my father's presence in the gentle breeze rustling through the trees he planted. Uncle Richard thought he could use a forged piece of paper to erase 28 years of devotion and sacrifice. But in the end, justice found its way, proving that a true legacy isn't written on paper. It is carved into the lives we touch and the truth we leave behind.